Hi. Committee will please come to order. Before we begin considering amendments, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Texas, ranking Republican member of the committee, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to commend you on the fair way you've conducted this markup this week. And this is a very difficult subject. It's a very complicated subject. It's a subject that there's strong feelings on both sides about. It would be an easy markup to lose control and let tempers flare, but that's not happened, and that is a tribute to your chairmanship. With regard to today's schedule, as you well know, you and I had a meeting last evening, and we have agreed that it wouldn't be to the benefit of the committee or the comity between the members if sometime this afternoon we begin to engage in parliamentary procedures that would force either a reading of the bill or an amendment which would take it beyond the scheduled closure time, or a previous question motion by the majority which would violate the traditions of the committee. So we have agreed to expedite the process today in terms of amendments and to put time limits on each amendment, approximately 10 minutes per side at the maximum. In return, we will have a final passage vote sometime this afternoon, within an hour or so after the House concludes its business. And when we come back after the memorial work period, you have committed to holding at least 1 day of hearing on the cap and trade allowance system, and if possible 2 days of hearings that would be fair and balanced, so that we can get into some of the issues that we've not yet been able to get into, just understanding what the mechanism is of the programs in Title III and Title IV.
Okay. I want to thank Mr. Barton for his cooperation in making this as smooth a markup as it has been up to this point. I know there are strong feelings on this issue, and it's important that we work through the consideration of various proposals in a spirit of comity and tolerance and receptivity. We do have a lot of work to do with not a great deal of time, and I think it makes sense to set time limits for the amendments that we'll be considering today. We've already seen some amendments that we've considered up to this point have taken an hour and a half to 2 hours, where I think we could have shortened the period of time for discussion. So if we try to discipline ourselves on both sides, and the Republican side has 20 amendments, we figure that on our side we'll have 5 to 10 amendments. If we limit the time to no more than 10 minutes per side, and many of the amendments will be 10 minutes total, 5 minutes on each side, and we'll have to make an evaluation as we go through the consideration of the amendments. I think that would allow us to be able to give the priority amendments on both sides consideration and an opportunity for members to vote on them. We will have 3 series of votes on the House floor today, so our work will not be uninterrupted. I have agreed with Mr. Barton that we will hold at least 1 day, full day of hearings on how the transmission, how the allocation system will work, and the mechanisms of it, and so we could get a greater spotlight on the mechanics of it all, and I think that would be a valuable hearing, and I've agreed that we will pursue that. We will, in fact, hold that day of hearings and then see if we have time and reason to have additional hearings on the subject. So with that understanding, I'd like to have us move forward now.
Can I ask?
Yes, gentleman from Nebraska.
In regard to the agreement on the hearings, was there any discussion of whether that's a full committee or subcommittee? So those of us that aren't on the subcommittee can participate? Is my specific interest.
We hadn't discussed that specifically, but I think the best approach would be to have it in the subcommittee, and all members who wish to attend may be able to participate. For the First Amendment this morning, I want to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Space, for what I think is one of the most important and significant amendments that we're going to have to this legislation. Mr. Space, you have an amendment at the desk. I'd ask unanimous consent. I'd ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read. And I'd like to recognize a gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Space, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As all of us know, this bill allocates emissions to electricity local distribution companies, the specific nature of which are located on page 553 of the bill in its present form, as well as to natural gas local distribution companies, which are located on page 554, both within section 782. The purpose of this amendment, which is being circulated as I speak, is to clarify and make certain that these allocated emissions or allocated emission allowances remit directly to the benefit of retail ratepayers. All of us have concerns about the effect that this legislation may have on consumers generally, and this bill has made numerous attempts to mitigate those concerns. This amendment helps to specify and again make certain that these allowances in particular are intended to benefit and will indeed benefit the retail ratepayers. The amendment affects not just the submission of these allowances, but also the auditing provisions of the bill itself. I think it's a positive change in all directions, and will provide some level of protection and assurances to the little guy out there. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
If the gentleman would yield to me on his time, Mr. Space, I think this amendment will reinforce one of the central policies of this bill, and that's protecting ratepayers. Our bill requires that allowances given to electricity and gas utilities must be used for the benefit of retail ratepayers. And this amendment strengthens these important provisions by making this policy even more explicit. For example, under the bill's allowance distribution provisions, EPA is required to audit a representative sample of electric distribution companies. Under the Space Amendment, it would be clear that these audits will be focused on ensuring that emission allowances have been used exclusively for the benefit of retail ratepayers. The heart of this bill is the protection of the ratepayer. The Space Amendment strengthens the provisions that are already in place, and I would certainly urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back his time, and the chair will recognize Mr. Barton.
And I'll be happy to yield some of my time to Mr. Walden. Ask the council a question. Could you define retail ratepayer?
Sorry, sir, the question was, have we defined retail ratepayer in this?
What is the definition of retail ratepayer?
It's not defined in the statute.
Okay, would a small dry cleaning business be a retail ratepayer?
If the dry cleaner is paying an electricity bill.
Would a small manufacturing facility that uses electricity to run its processes be a retail ratepayer?
If it's paying an electricity bill.
So anybody that pays an electricity bill is a retail ratepayer?
Yes.
Does the author of the amendment agree with that?
I agree. If they're purchasing that electricity from an electric, and actually a natural gas distribution company as well. Applies to both natural gas and electricity distribution companies.
So your definition of retail ratepayer is not exclusive to homeowners and condos and apartments. It includes small businesses and manufacturing facilities, basically anybody that doesn't have a direct industrial contract with the electricity provider.
That is correct.
Okay. I'll yield to Mr. Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. That was the question I was going to go after. But what assurance, I mean, I appreciate your opinion, but what assurance do we have in statute? Is retail ratepayer defined anywhere in the statutes?
No, it is not.
So it is commonly assumed that that is anybody who pays an electricity bill or a gas bill under this circumstance will be considered a retail ratepayer.
So long as they purchase it from a local electricity or, in the case of natural gas distribution company, yes.
What about situations like where you're, and I may be wrong on this, but this is all coming at us fast, like Bonneville Power Administration has DSIs. These are industries that purchase directly power. I believe they're allocated power directly from the Bonneville Power Administration. Would they qualify if you're a DSI?
I'm sorry, I missed the question, sir. Someone was talking to me.
It happens. I'm sympathetic
I'm
with
sorry.
it. A DSI is a direct service industry, so they purchase power directly from, I believe, Bonneville Power Administration. Would they be treated as a retail ratepayer
I don't know.
if it comes from one of the power marketing agencies like TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, or Bonneville Power Administration?
The bill, if I could...
Certainly, yeah.
Gentlemen, sorry. The bill itself provides for allowances to be distributed by, specifically by, natural gas local distribution companies and electricity local distribution companies. If these are ratepayers purchasing their power from those local distribution companies, they are considered purchasing retail power and are ratepayers pursuant to the amendment, and I believe the bill itself.
Right. So my question is are the organizations like Bonneville Power Administration considered a local distribution company for purposes of this act?
No, I can't be.
I would refer to counsel for the definition of local distribution company.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah. So I'm just asking your professional opinion to counsel.
Because they're a generation company.
I think I understand the intent of the
Gentlemen-
legislation and the definitional
Gentlemen,
intent.
yield.
Yes,
This-
certainly.
This is a power company purchasing from another power company. Is that?
No. This would be an industrial user that purchases, I believe, directly, and I may be wrong on this, but I didn't have a chance to run this out in advance, directly from Bonneville, for example. And so my only question is, are these PMA, I think they're PMAs, public market, power marketing, are they considered an LDC for purposes of this act? Because I know it's your intent to do that, but I just want to make sure as we're legislating.
They distribute as well as generate the power?
They may, yeah.
The definition of electricity local distribution company appears on page 567. It means an electric utility that has a legal, regulatory, or contractual obligation to deliver electricity directly to retail consumers in the United States, regardless of whether that entity or another entity sells the electricity as a commodity to those consumers, and the retail rates of which, except in the case of a registered electric co-op, are regulated by a state regulatory authority, regulatory commission, municipality, public utility, or by an Indian tribe pursuant to tribal law. And that, again, is on page 567.
And so, I'm sorry I got interrupted too, just a minute. But the last qualifier is that they are regulated by a public utility commission of some sort?
The retail rates of which, except in the case of a registered electric cooperative, are regulated by a state authority or some other type of regulatory commission.
Because Bonneville, I think, does its own rate-setting cases. So would they...
Gentlemen's time has expired. I don't know that we can get a specific answer. The council will give us a further information to help us reach some conclusion.
I would be.
We're not
Mr.
sure
Chair-
whether Bonneville Power Authority sells wholesale or retail. If they sell wholesale, then it does not appear they would fall within the definition of electricity LDC, but we don't know Bonneville Power's situation.
Mr. Chairman, and I know we need to move this along, would the chair and the author of the amendment be willing to work with us on this? I assume it would be that you would want to include anybody that's selling power to a retail ratepayer.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, the gentleman's request relates not just to the amendment, but to the entirety of the bill itself. Because the question that you've raised about the eligibility of Bonneville for the allowances in question applies regardless of whether this amendment is passed or not.
Let me express my willingness to work with the gentleman, talk it through, and see if we can resolve any disagreements.
It's one of the reasons we're doing some hearings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be willing to accept that commitment because I think I understand what you're trying to get to. I just want to make sure there isn't a group that's been overlooked by accident.
And I'd certainly be willing to work with the gentleman in
Thank you. We'll
accommodating
follow
those
up with
concerns.
the.
Mr. Chairman, we are prepared to accept the amendment.
The time has expired on the debate. The vote now comes on the space amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Who seeks recognition, Mr. Barton, on your side?
Mr. Walden.
Let me make an announcement. We've considered amendments to Title I. We've considered amendments to Title II. We've considered amendments to Title III. We're going to open the bill up for amendments to any title. So the bill is open for amendment at any point.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It is, actually, I'll throw you a curveball. It's actually Upton 003, which is unrelated to Upton 007,
Chairman,
our secret
I'll
agent
reserve a point of
from
order.
Michigan.
The point of order has been reserved. The gentleman from Oregon is offering an amendment that has the name of the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, and without objection, that amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this amendment is to build upon the notion that renewables are a good thing and that renewable energy that doesn't emit any more than those on the list that you'll find on page 21, that doesn't exceed or perhaps even comes in less, should be included. And of course, as technologies develop, there will be new ones that may not be on this list. So this amendment's really pretty simple. It says any source of electric generation with emissions of air pollutants that do not exceed those of the emission source listed in any of the preceding subparagraphs, which has the highest emission levels of air pollutants. So it amends the Clean Air Act and basically says there are some others out there that don't pollute, that should be included. Some new technologies may come along, and they should be treated as renewable energy under this act. And I would yield to my colleague from Michigan for further comment.
Well, thank you. I thank the gentleman for offering this brilliant amendment. I'd note for the record I did vote against cloning, so it is your amendment. You know, we don't want to pick winners and losers. The whole purpose is that we have renewable source of energy, no matter what the cost, and this fits that criteria. And so, whether it be woody biomass, whether it be existing hydro or new hydro, all those different things ought to qualify as a renewable part of the renewable base. And we're going to have another amendment a little bit later on that looks at states that have actually embarked on a renewable portfolio standard. We want those states to keep their rights in terms of what they've done as what they've done to identify their base. But this is a greater universe of what would count as renewable, and I think it's a very good amendment. I yield my time back to the gentleman from Oregon.
And I yield back and ask your support on this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Gentleman withdraws his point of order. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment sounds neutral in the definition of a renewable, but it in effect would allow nuclear to be considered a renewable fuel. We've had this issue before us a number of times during the committee's consideration of this legislation. While nuclear has the enormous advantage of not emitting carbon dioxide, it is not a renewable fuel. It's based on fuel from uranium, which is mined, which is not renewable. It's similar to coal in that sense. And when we defined renewable, the idea of having nuclear as part of the definition was not what was what those who support renewables had in mind. It's already a technology that's been available, been in use, plays a very important and valuable role in our portfolio of energy supplies. But if we had nuclear considered a renewable, it would, in effect, crowd out other renewables that we want to encourage to be developed. That was the reason why in the compromise on the RES that we said that future nuclear power would be not considered in the base for how much would have to be achieved for the renewable objectives. And I think this amendment overturns the compromise, undermines what we're trying to do in the renewable area, discourages the development of new renewables that need attention and need guarantee that they're going to be marketable in order to make more renewable fuels available.
Would the gentleman yield for a
Gentleman
brief
yield.
question?
Yes, I'll be glad to yield, Mr. Up.
One of the things that other countries do, France, UK, Japan, soon to be China, they are now in the process of recycling spent nuclear fuel, high-level nuclear fuel. Our country, of course, has a ban on that. I'd like to think that at some point down the line we will reverse that. We'll start that in this country. If, in fact, we had that program here, would the gentleman then support this amendment if we could recycle it, knowing that you can do it
Let
up
me,
to 90%?
Let me not make a decision here, sitting here, without getting all the information. Maybe, maybe not, but I don't want to decide it now.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Since I yielded back early, if I could just make a point, and I appreciate your yielding to me. I think as we look at these renewables, any of us could make an argument that something has to happen to develop them. For example, there's a fairly high intensity of energy that's consumed to create solar panels. We're actually making them in my state. There are things that have to be mined that go into those solar panels. When you look at the wind turbines that are going up in rapid pace in my district, there's a lot of carbon, there's a lot of steel, there's all the electrical components. And so into every source of energy, even renewable, part of how you get it into the transmission line, part of the equipment and the towers and the blades and all of that requires some level of energy. Actually, and interestingly enough, and I haven't mentioned this word yet this morning, but I will, woody biomass is the most renewable probably thing out there because it just keeps growing. And so I hope that at some point we can fix that problem in this bill. This would do that. All this bill says, all this amendment says is, as long as you don't emit, we're trying to deal with this carbon issue in the atmosphere is what this bill is trying to achieve. Why don't you work with us to generate new power from sources that don't add to greenhouse gas emissions, like hydro, like biomass, like nuclear, to deal with the atmospheric issues that the IPCC and others have said are so important to deal with. So I hope you'll take another look at this amendment and support it, and I appreciate your courtesy in yielding your time to me on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Reclaiming my time, I'd be happy to continue to work with the gentleman, not to continue, to begin to work with the gentleman, because we've been very anxious to do that. But this amendment is not acceptable, and those other decisions that you would like us to look at for the future, I think we need to examine carefully and see if there's a way we can reach agreement.
Mr. Chairman, will you yield?
My time has expired, and I'm going to recognize Mr. Barton, and he can yield to.
Mr. Chairman, I
As he
thank
sees
you, and
fit.
I'll yield some of my time to Mr. Gingrey. I don't know if it's good news or bad news, Mr. Chairman, but this was the nice amendment. You know, this is the amendment we're actually put forward thinking that it would be accepted and you would work with us on this. The authors of the legislation are at war with themselves. The stated goal of this legislation is to reduce greenhouse gases that are made by man in the United States. That's a noble goal. If that's truly the goal, and the primary goal, this amendment should be accepted because it's politically neutral. It simply says any source of electric generation that has emissions of air pollutants that don't exceed those of the emissions listed in the preceding paragraphs, which have the highest emission levels, would qualify. And you're exactly right. Nuclear power would qualify because it is zero emissions. Hydro would qualify because it has zero emissions. It is possible that clean coal technology at some point in time would qualify. It is possible that several other technologies that we don't even know about would qualify. But what this amendment does is it takes the politics out of the definition of renewable. If your goal is to reduce man-made greenhouse gases in the United States, this amendment should be accepted. If that's not the primary goal, if the primary goal is to pick winners and losers in the emerging alternative technologies, it's a different ball game. I would point out that some of the sources that are listed, some of the solar voltaics and things of that sort, are extremely expensive and very, very unlikely to ever be large baseload sources of energy. On the other hand, hydroelectric power and nuclear power from these new reactor designs could be very much a part of a future clean energy strategy. I would also point out what Mr. Upton did, and that is that if the United States reverses Carter administration policy and decides to reprocess its spent civilian commercial reactor rods, you can recycle, I think, about 98%, is it 90, of the energy that's in those rods, which would diminish the need for a Yucca Mountain or similar type repository. So this is a difficult one to, I would think, to say no to, and I would hope that some members of the majority would say yes and join with the minority to pass it. And I'll yield to Mr. Gingrey.
And I thank the ranking member for yielding, and I certainly do support the amendment. And I think it's important to note that while the chairman says uranium is not renewable, it indeed is ubiquitous. If coal is plentiful in this country, and indeed it is, we probably have 150 years worth of reserves of coal, uranium may be the most abundant element on the periodic table. And it's easily mined. It's here in the United States. We don't have to be dependent on some country that doesn't like us very much. So, and then of course the point was brought up by Mr. Upton that the reprocessing technique that's used in France, where 80% of their power is generated from nuclear, it is so close to being a renewable source that I can't understand why we wouldn't include it. And the other thing, the final point I will make is, with nuclear, you cannot pick winners and losers. You can put a nuclear plant pretty much anywhere. We're going to have 4 in the southeast in my state of Georgia, at Plant Vogel and Plant Hatch. And we're producing 20% of our electricity by nuclear, and we can grow that. So I thank the gentleman for yielding time. I'll yield back to him. But clearly, nuclear is so darn close to being renewable that I think it meets the definition. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For the last 5 minutes of debate on this amendment, I want to recognize Mr. Markey, but before I do, if I might, on that 5 minutes, indicate that we're not arguing whether nuclear should be used. We're not arguing whether coal should be used. We want sources of energy to be used that can be used in a way that protects the environment, and we're able to do that with nuclear now, and we hope to be able to do that with coal at some point, and we're putting a lot of money into achieving that objective. But this is a question that goes to the definition of renewable. Mr. Barton says perhaps the majority is at war with itself. Well, let me indicate the majority is going to win the war because with ourselves, because what we wanted to do is encourage the use of a wide diversity of fuels, nuclear, coal, natural gas, oil, and renewables, some of which are already available, and much more will be very effective and low cost if we give the encouragement and the market for it to be developed. Mr. Markey, to close the debate.
I thank the Chair very much. As the amendment is drafted, it says that any source of electric generation with emissions of air pollutants that do not exceed those of the emission source listed in any of the preceding paragraphs will essentially qualify. Well, our definition for renewables in the legislation that we're now considering is that 20% of electricity by the year 2020 should come from renewables or efficiency. Since 20% of all electricity in the United States today is generated by nuclear power, that would mean that there would be no new renewables at all, since the entire standard would be met by the existing base of nuclear power in our country. A perfect match. 20% nuclear already in existence, 20% is what we're calling for.
Would the gentleman yield on that point? Briefly.
I would be glad to yield.
If this were to pass, we would be willing to accept an amendment to change the standard to 30% perhaps. Move it up so that you get nuclear and you get your others too.
Well, again, let me continue. Hydropower is another 6% already in existence. As the chairman already pointed out, our goal is not in this legislation to harm nuclear power. In fact, most of the major nuclear energy utilities in the United States have endorsed this bill. And the reason that they have endorsed it is that they know that once there is a cap placed on carbon, that their ability to go to the capital markets to raise money, combined with the loan guarantee programs, which the federal government has already authorized, will increase the revival of the industry, which the gentleman from Georgia has already indicated is occurring at the Vogtle site in his state already. So this is really not a question of whether or not nuclear is going to be a part of the mix in the future. It has been in the past. It will be again. And this bill is going to play a large role in reviving it, regardless of what anyone might think about it as a technology. This legislation, however, is also trying to focus upon biomass, on wind, on solar, on geothermal, on hydrokinetic, and on a whole group of other technologies which historically have been underfunded. The nuclear sector itself over the years has been a favored technology of the federal government, and that is why it is up to 20% of our total electricity mix. That is why there is more electricity generated from nuclear in the United States than there is in the country of France. And it is going to continue to increase. And the gentleman from Georgia is saying that he already is witnessing that down in his home state. So the evisceration of the renewable goals which we have for our country
would be complete if this amendment was adopted. I can't urge more strongly that the members reject it. This is part of a very well-balanced plan that we have going forward that includes clean coal, tens of billions of dollars for carbon sequestration for the coal industry. Nuclear has loan guarantee programs and other programs that are included. I urge a no vote so that the renewables can play the same role in the future as these other energy technologies.
All time has been complete. All time has been taken in the debate. We'll now proceed to a roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton. Ms. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Yeah, I will. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no. Yeah, I see him. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes aye.
Have all members responded
Mr.
to the call to roll? Mr. Space.
Right. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, aye. Yep.
What do you have?
30 for you and 26 for me.
Clerk ready to report the vote?
Yes, sir. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 26 and the nays were 29.
26 ayes, 29 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The Chair would like to now look to the Democratic side. And Mr. Space, I understand you have an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Space of Ohio.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. We'll have it distributed,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, helps clarify and particularize certain agricultural offsets, a rather comprehensive list that has been prepared in consultation with farmers, both in my district and throughout the state of Ohio. One of the concerns that farmers have raised regarding the offsets program is the lack of specificity. And this amendment would simply provide that specificity and certainty in the process, and I think make many of our farmers more comfortable with the legislation.
Gentleman, yield to me.
Certainly.
I understand the concerns you're raising that this amendment is trying to address. The agricultural and forestry sectors engage in many activities that sequester substantial amounts of carbon. These activities are expected to provide a significant source of low-cost emission offsets under this bill, and producing and selling such offsets could help provide farmers and timber interests an important new source of income. I join your interest in ensuring that high-quality agricultural offsets play a significant role in achieving the bill's emissions reduction goals as cost effectively as possible. I do have some concerns about the amendment as drafted. The amendment provides a very detailed list of specific activities that would receive offset credits, but just listing an activity doesn't make it a source of offsets. Before offsets can be issued, EPA must develop ways to measure how much carbon each activity would sequester in the soil or in biomass. Then EPA can issue one offset for every ton of carbon sequestered. I think we need to make sure that EPA has the measurement methodologies in place before we give offset credits to specific activities. And these methodologies involve highly technical scientific calculations that must be left to the expert agency. So I don't think it makes sense to try to spell all this out before EPA and the Offsets Integrity Advisory Board established by this legislation have a chance to assess the carbon sequestered by each of these activities. But I agree that EPA and the Offsets Integrity Advisory Board should consider each of these activities and should develop measurement methodologies for every source of high-quality offsets. If the gentleman is willing to withdraw his amendment, I propose that we insert language into the committee report laying out this list and directing EPA and the Offsets Integrity Advisory Board to consider each of these activities as a potential source of offset credits. And I'd be willing to work further on this matter with the gentleman as this bill moves forward.
I thank the chairman for his concern, and given the representations made back today.
Would the gentleman
Sorry to
yield?
interrupt. Before you withdraw, would you yield me a few seconds?
Or me, either one.
Oh, sorry.
Yield the gentleman 30 seconds.
I too am concerned on behalf of our farmers. There's another aspect here that I'd like to just bring up for discussion, and that's livestock, where according to this plan they have no opportunities for any type of credits because critters tend to burp and flagellate and eat corn, which according to yesterday's discussion is going to be a net contributor to carbon, because that's going to be processed, or I mean included in this. So livestock needs to be accounted for in here and is not. I'll yield back to my friend from Ohio.
I thank the gentleman for his concern, and given the...
Would the gentleman yield to Mr. Barton?
Oh,
I think he
of
wanted
course.
to make a comment.
I'd just say we would accept it as is, and I'd like to add to the list, but I will accept what you've got. It's a move in the right direction.
Thank you to the ranking member as well. Given the chairman's representations concerning his willingness to work with us and the concerns raised both here in this hearing as well as in advance, I would withdraw the amendment and look forward to working with the chairman in refining this list.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield my time back to
Then I reserve a right to object to the
go ahead.
unanimous consent.
Well, there is no unanimous consent request.
withdraw?
But let's see. Why don't you yield, Mr. Space?
I just have a quick...
Morgan.
I'll yield the remaining time.
Well, I just have a question for you. As I was reading it, on page 2, on line 14, it talks about afforestation or reforestation of acreage not forested as of October 18th, 2007. Where did that date come from? It's very specific, and I actually was Googling trying to figure out what event happened on that day. And I'm just curious. It
is a curious anomaly, and my response to that would be simply that this list is comprehensive and was prepared in connection with consultation with members of the agricultural industry and community. And the honest truth is, I'm not sure where the date is.
All right.
It does appear arbitrary, but
it just caught my attention. It seemed, I don't know why the 16th or the 19th or, you know. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Ohio withdraws his amendment. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rogers for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman be recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that the Rogers Amendment 2, 4, and 6 be considered en bloc in the interests of time today.
Without objection, the amendments...
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Okay, well, first of all, the gentlelady reserves a point of order, but without objection, the amendments will be considered en bloc. And Mr. Rogers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I come from a state that's been hit very, very hard. And I have to tell you, when you're sitting at your kitchen table and you work for a small auto parts manufacturer, you kind of have to scratch your head. Michigan is very proud of the role that they played in World War II as the arsenal of democracy. When the United States called them, they went from making pickup trucks in about late 1940 with 15,000 parts to less than a year later on that same assembly line pumping out bombers with over 1 million parts. Helped create the middle class. Rosie the Riveter got their start in Michigan. Kind of changed for a whole generation about how we embrace people into the workplace. So they scratch their heads and think, well, I'm a little confused. This is a great country. Through innovation, the government didn't tell them how to do that. They just asked them to go from pickup trucks to airplanes. Nobody told them to do the Chevy Bolt, of which they've spent billions of their own money at General Motors to research and develop and get close to production, or lithium-ion batteries. But now, somehow, we've given up on all of that, and we're going to ask that particular family to pay a very heavy price. We're going to ask that family to pay more for their electric bills, more for their natural gas. And how is this going to solve the problem? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to take money from those individuals, money from small businesses, and we're going to send it to Wall Street to trade in a commodity that you can't see and you can never, ever take delivery of. And oh, by the way, we've even figured out to put a loophole in here for overseas credit. So companies, if they have operations overseas, they get to figure out a new way on Wall Street to get credits there and bring it back and make more money off of the very people who are sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out how to pay their light bill. And they scratch their heads some more and say, wait a minute, in the last 100 days, the democratically controlled government of the United States forced out auto dealers, about, I don't know, I guess they're up to over 3,000 of them. The government forced them to do that. Hundreds of thousands of people will lose their jobs because the government told them to close. By the way, those are private companies with private assets. Oh, and here's the other answer that they came up with, the government proffered viability plan for General Motors, and I'm going to quote from a UAW letter sent to us May 15th, 2009. They were asking members of Congress to join with them and talking to the Obama administration so that GM should be required to maintain the maximum number of jobs in the United States instead of outsourcing more production to other countries. Because of the government proffered viability plan, they're going to go from, let's see, the share of GM sales in the U.S. market that will be imported from these countries will increase from 15.5% to 23.5%. And by the way, they're going to close 16 U.S. manufacturing facilities. They're going to close them here, from my friends on the other side of the aisle, and import them from places like, and quoting from again from the UAW letter, Korea, Japan, and China for sale in this country. Thank you for working so hard all those years to develop and build some of the state-of-the-art manufacturing in the United States of America. Here's our gift to you. We're going to charge you more for your electric bill, going to charge you more for your natural gas bill, going to charge you more for your gasoline. Every product that you use will go up in price. Oh, and thanks a lot, we're going to ask that we import more vehicles because somehow, maybe that helps our carbon footprint, I don't know. And then they read this in the paper. As Detroit crumbles, China emerges as auto epicenter. They are fast after it, gang. They want our middle class, and they're going to do everything they can to steal it. And what you do with this bill, and what you didn't do by adding India and China is saying, hey, listen, you either need to be with us or we're not going to let you artificially steal these jobs of people who are killing themselves to make it. You say tough. And you know what? You say so tough, and we say, yeah, we know we're going to lose jobs. How do you do that? Because in Title IV, you have Section 422, 425, 426, and 427 said, boy, we know we're going to lose a lot of jobs, and you budget somewhere up to $380 billion a year in a separate program to pay for all the jobs that you know you're going to lose in this bill. and it's not even part of unemployment. You created a whole new government program. So a government program to take their money away from them, charge them more to get up in the morning and use their water and their electricity and make their eggs and their kids to do their homework and to drive to work. You have a government program to do that. And oh, by the way, we know that's really stupid. So we're going to create a whole nother government program to give you wages, and we're going to pay for some of your health care for up to 3 years, because we know this is really kind of a bad idea. But you know what? Get over it. It's the buggy whip time. But you know what? The buggy whip went away. We're still going to buy cars in America. We're still going to produce things. And this is what you do. 577,000 Americans earn a mean salary of $44,000 a year making auto parts. Goodbye. 210,000 Americans work directly in auto manufacturing. They earn a mean salary of $59,000. Goodbye. This bill says this: give these people a break. If China and India don't comply, if we do lose one single job in this sector due to this bill, stop. Let them breathe. Let them send their kids to college. Let them earn and be a part of the American dream. And I'd yield back the remainder of my time.
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are any members seeking recognition in opposition to the Rogers amendment? Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank the gentleman for his amendment and for his remarks. But, you know, as we have gone through this process, of course, we have incorporated into this bill the Cash for Clunkers proposal, which is aimed indeed not just at dealing with the issue of job loss after the fact, but rather is intended to help those very dealers that we're talking about, and as well as improving our environment at the same time. And obviously multiple benefits are a good thing, and helping consumers while we're at it. And I would just ask my friend from Michigan, as I know how difficult it is, because coming from where I come from, we face much of the same concern. I, too, saw the letter from the United Auto Workers, and it's a rather lengthy letter, and it has many statements in it. Of course, one of the things that it asks us to do is to communicate with the President, and I just don't know. I would just ask the gentleman if he has taken the opportunity to send him a letter.
We absolutely have. And remember, this is the second viability plan that was proffered by the President's government-run car committee to run the car companies.
Well, I disagree, claiming my time. I disagree with the assertions that are being made that the government is the one that is forcing the closings of the dealerships. And I appreciate your, yes, I do. I disagree with that. I disagree with that. And
It's
we
the
can
car
have
czar
that
in the car
discussion.
committee who is appointed by the President of the United States.
I understand, but the decisions are being made by the companies on what dealerships to close.
By the TARP.
They fired the
And
guy
I
that
would-
came up with the plan that didn't have
reclaiming
this
my
in it.
time, reclaiming my time. But what I would just encourage, and I look forward to doing with the gentleman from Michigan, is taking steps both within this committee and outside of this committee to pursue the actions to stop the job loss. But this bill here is not what is going to cause the auto industry to continue to suffer. And by the time this would kick in, even if your scenario was correct, those folks would be in a world of hurt, and this would not be something that would help them. We need to take action today, like the Cash for Clunkers proposal and other initiatives, to make sure that the scenario you point out in this amendment that would, in effect, kill the bill, kill the program in the bill, doesn't actually come to fruition. And I look forward to working with you in every way that we can outside of this committee, in this committee, along the way, to make sure that that happens. And I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the Rogers amendment? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
What I've done is I've gone back to my math again, and I encourage all members to, once again, do math in the bill. So, Mr. Rogers, I'd like for you to know that the authors of this legislation have taken your concerns into consideration, because they have created a climate change worker adjustment assistance program, which is modeled after the TAA in NAFTA. Can I please. And so when I do this, I use the Indiana's wage average, which is 37,770. Now keep in mind, though, that the national average, guys, can you please? The average is 43,000 according to the Bureau of Labor. So let's just do a back of the envelope math. So I want to address your concerns, Mr. Rogers, that are in the bill. So if it's modeled after the TA new program, displaced workers are entitled to 156 weeks of income supplement. We have unemployment income assistance shall be 70% of the average weekly wage of the worker, not to exceed the state's average wage. So we have a displaced workers entitled to 80% of a monthly health care premium, of which we have an average cost of $1,545. We have displaced workers entitled to 1,500 job assistance and displaced workers entitled to 1,500 moving assistance, job counseling, and training. Now, let's do the math, and I'm going to do this sort of based on Indiana. So on annual compensation, the bill provides up to $37,770 unemployment assistance to workers. If we accept what Heritage says about a loss of about 2.5 million jobs, if I add in just the Indiana, I'm not even doing the national average, so I'll do a little low cost, low balling here, that comes up to $94 billion. When I add in the health care benefit to this, if we do 80% of the premium, so that's $1,236 annually per person, times 2.5 million, that's a $3 billion cost. If I do the job assistance, provides up to 1,500 in job assistance counseling, times the 2.5, that's a $3.75 billion cost. If I add the job moving, along with job moving is about $3.75 billion. If I do the job training, which costs on average $8,000 times the 2.5 million jobs, that's $20 billion. So you add up $94.4 billion, $3.09 billion, plus $3.75 billion, plus $3.75 billion again, and $20 billion in job training. Mr. Rogers, I'd like for you to know that in the bill, your concern with regard to individuals that are going to lose their jobs, the bill provides $125 billion in job assistance. So what I realize here is that we are going to borrow from the Chinese, but collateral on this loan will be these manufacturing jobs for which you have dire concern about. I'll yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
I would thank the gentleman. I appreciate that you'd bring that up. And one of the things that we have to understand is that in this bill, as you have pointed out, the dollar amount, but there's also a whole other section on the training dollars that we added up that takes it up to as much as $380 billion a year for people they know will lose their jobs in this bill. And there's other programs. That doesn't count one penny of a new government program we're going to create to try to figure out, after we have hurt the poor in this country by raising their electric bill somewhere between $1,500 and $3,100 per year extra, we're going to create another program to try to figure out how we took that money from them in the first place and figure out how to get it back. And I guess our argument on this is there is so much a better way to do this, that through innovation versus this big government mandate of taking and figuring out who wins and who loses and who gets some allocation. And by the way, even the chairman of this committee, the sponsor of this bill, said that he didn't even know what all was in this bill yesterday. So we're going to vote on a bill that we think is somewhere around $2.3 trillion that will clearly cost jobs. Otherwise, you wouldn't have so many different sections in this bill dedicated to those people who you know are going to lose their jobs, and a whole other section trying to figure out how to keep the poor from going under by a new government program to figure out how we get their new cost in energy back to them in some form. Of course, it won't be 100%, because that never quite works when you send a dollar to Washington, D.C. And our argument is there is a better, more innovative way. Don't give up on the next generation of Americans. Don't quit on them. This bill quits on them. It says you don't believe that they can do it, that they can innovate, that they can do things like send a man to the moon, as you said. By the way, if they didn't meet that deadline, hundreds of thousands of people didn't lose their jobs. Big difference. Believe in this next generation of Americans, and you will be surprised how fast we meet these goals without a huge government mandate and the largest energy tax in the history of the United States.
Time has expired. Are we ready for the question, or does any other member wish to speak on the 5 minutes that we could take on the Democratic side? If not, we'll proceed to a vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Yukowski. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch.
No.
Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Aye. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Aye. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Aye. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green votes no.
Mr. Wiener, how do you wish to vote?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. No. Mr. Wiener votes no. Mr. Wiener votes no.
What did he do? He just looked around.
Any member wish to be recorded that's not recorded, or recorded in a different way? If not, the clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 22 and the nays were 32.
22 ayes, 32 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. Who wishes to be recognized? Mr. Melanson, I understand you have an amendment at the desk. The clerk will the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Melanson of Louisiana.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I wanted to introduce this amendment because of the issue with mid-level ethanol additive and the concern with the manufacturers of the engines, whether they're automobile engines, marine engines, whatever, that could be impacted. As a person who has experienced ethanol additives in a marine engine, fortunately I only had to overhaul the engine afterward. I didn't have to replace it completely, but I've had the experience, so it comes firsthand, and I would hope that no one else has to go through that because of something that we're doing for the good of the country. I'd ask that we request for waivers to allow the E15 blends and that we take a look at the science first. We should encourage more deployment of biofuels, but not without considering the impact of legacy systems. Make sure that car warranties are kept intact. Emergency generators after storms are still running, which is very important to the folks in my region of the country. And that the outdoor engines, marine and otherwise, assets that people invest in can be protected. This amendment simply asks the Science Advisory Board of EPA to take advice from scientific community before they provide a waiver to E15, and to make sure that in the event that there is any potential problems, that E10 would be available throughout the entire country to make sure that those people who still had warranties and or engines that did not perform with the mid-level ethanol additive would be protected and be able to continue operating those vehicles. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce this amendment, and I wanted it to make sure that it was on the radar screen and included in the record. And with that, I would withdraw it, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for withdrawing his amendment and raising this very important issue. We will now go to the Republican side. Mr. Blunt, you
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's amendment number 595A, and it's the amendment that says 20%.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read.
What is he doing?
Are we waiting for the amendment to be distributed, Chairman?
Let's see, it looks like there's some question of whether it's there.
This is not an en bloc amendment, correct?
Apparently, we offered that, and I think it's not en bloc. It's just one amendment.
While it's being distributed, the gentleman's recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is an amendment that I hope the majority will find an improved amendment over an amendment I offered a couple of days ago. This amendment, again, deals with residential utility rates. It's an amendment that creates a way for the administrator of the EPA to determine the residential rates in the country. And if and the EPA administrator, I'm told, does this in any case. So this information's available. If the administrator would determine that the average retail price of electricity for end users in one or more of the 9 census divisions of the country has increased by more than 20% from the 2009 rate plus inflation. So you get the 2009 rate, you get inflation, and then you'd get up to 20% before this amendment would have impact. And if the administrator determines that this increase of more than 20% above inflation was the result of the implementation of Title III of this Act, then the provisions of Title III will cease to be effective. The rest of the amendment, the rest of the act would be effective. The chairman had some concern that people would not be able to move forward with other activities under the bill if the entire act was not effective, and the rest of the act would be effective under this amendment. Only Title III would not be. Mr. Chairman, I'd point out even yesterday at the first meeting, a webcast meeting of the President's selected Economic Recovery Advisory Board, that board had a number of concerns about this act. Martin Feldstein from Harvard told the President that the cost per capita of this act could range from $400 to $1,500 per person in additional annual expenses. Now, for a family of the average family in the country is, I think, 2.56. That cost is substantial in that household. This would address the utility portion of that cost, and I'd hope that our members would look at Title III, and if Title III is a reason for an increase of 20% or more above inflation, that Title III would cease to be effective. And I'd yield time to Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, my friend from Missouri. I just want to say this would almost be a Gore amendment, and that when the Vice President was here, he said that I think that rates wouldn't go up more than a postage stamp. Well, we're insisting that it be 20% nationally. I know some states, particularly those with a heavy reliance on coal. I looked to Indiana, I looked to Ohio, I looked to Michigan, I looked at much of the Midwest, where coal generates as much as 90% of our electricity, and some of those utilities have talked about a 40 or 50% increase in rates, but this is a 20% national rate, just as a safeguard to make sure, in fact, that this bill doesn't gouge consumers. And so I think it's a worthwhile amendment. I think we picked up some Democratic support on a couple days ago when you had a lower percentage. I would like to think that we might be able to get this, knowing that it's 20% in essence plus inflation over that 09 rate, and I look forward to the vote, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd yield some time to Ms. Blackburn from Tennessee.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for this amendment. I do support the amendment. I would just like to point out in Tennessee what we are looking at. Our residential usage is expected to go up 42% under this legislation. That would be a $612 increase for our residences. Our commercial rates we expect to see that be about a $2,500 per year increase for our commercial users. Our industrial users are looking at a $36,000 increase, and that is because of the expectation of a 42% increase in those rates. And both the rate and what you are paying matters. I applaud the gentleman. This would stop this at 20%. That would cut the increase in half for what is expected. I thank him, I support it, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back the remainder.
Gentleman yields back the time. The chair would speak in opposition very, very briefly. We've had this debate and this issue over and over again. It's pretty much the same as what Mr. Blunt offered to Title I, except it's almost word for word, but there are some minor changes. The bill still directly protects consumers from increases by allocating 39% of allowances to be returned to consumers via local distribution companies. And what consumers care about are the bills and not the rates. This provision would strike as a result of 20% increase that the provisions of Title III would cease to be effective. It's not a reasonable, in my view, way to respond to that kind of a circumstance. And I would hope that we would oppose this as we've done similar amendments that have been offered in the last couple of days. And I yield to Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. Mr. Chairman, there's no one on this committee who's more concerned about the potential for rate increases for our ratepayers, but this is not the way to address the problem. I am very concerned about this potential. I've expressed that publicly and privately. The chairman has reached a very good compromise whereby many of the LDCs, all of the LDCs, will get free allowances that will pass through to the ratepayers, and I think that's a good way of dealing with it. It will offset the economic impact and the potential for rate increases. If that doesn't happen, then we can come back and revisit it, but to suspend the provisions of Title III would not be the way to go. I oppose the amendment.
I appreciate what the gentleman has to say, especially now that we have the space amendment as part of the legislation. It's very clear the ratepayers are going to be protected. I'd like to proceed to a vote. I understand that Republicans would like a roll call vote. Let's call the roll, and I hope we can complete it before members have to leave. But as your name is called, if there's no objection, people can leave. And if all members haven't had a chance to vote, after the roll, we'll keep the roll open for members to come after the votes on the floor.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch.
No.
Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye.
I like you guys.
Mr. Whitfield.
You treat me nice.
Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Let's see. Hold on. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Any other?
After all members have
Ms. Eshoo.
responded to this call,
Ms.
the roll
Eshoo
will be
votes
held
no.
open, and we will return promptly after the last of the 3 votes on the House floor.
It's up. So we recessed. We reset.